Welcome to Module 5 of Centering the Public Interest in Integrated Data System Analytics. We've come to the end of our modules. To recap, we've learned about the FAIR2 framework for integrating community knowledge in data analytics and addressing discrimination bias. That was in Module 1. In Module 2, we saw how FAIR2 data chats can guide our understanding and use of race and gender data in administrative data systems. Next, in Module 3 and 4, we discussed two types of biases that are typical of administrative data: label bias with Jessie in Module 3, and collider bias with Amari and Liam in Module 4. Now we get to wrap up by providing some recommendations on how to identify and address bias in integrated data system analytics. So we're going to walk through this schematic on the right, and at each stage in the research process, we're going to consider possible mitigation strategies. First, let's talk about the research question. This is often where the research process starts, by asking questions. In attempting to mitigate the potential for bias, we would suggest adjusting the research question to be more specific and reflective of the actual data collected. For example, if you remember our illustration of label bias in homelessness research in Module 3, instead of saying that the research question is to estimate the risk of homelessness, when we don't have data to actually measure homelessness, we would say that the research question we can answer given the data we have is, what is the risk of shelter use? Homelessness is hard to measure, and not all types of homelessness will be reflected in shelter use data. So while we are narrow in our question, we are being transparent about what we can measure with shelter use data alone. Taking this a step further, we might be interested in how the experience of homelessness differs by gender. But this isn't as specific and transparent as we can be. So instead, we'd say that the research question is how shelter use differs by gender, specifically by the most recent self-reported binary gender, or however we define and use gender in the analysis we run. Here, it's important to specify how gender and race are classified in administrative data we use, and how, if at all, we've reconciled classification differences in the data that we analyze. As we saw in Module 2, our aim will be to maximize categorical granularity in the classification of race and gender so that diverse identities remain representable. However, we would not do it to a point that we could risk the re-identification of small populations. Okay, so now let's talk about the research design. That is the blueprint for conducting the research project. After arriving at a well-defined question, researchers must figure out what methods are best suited to explore that question, and importantly, under what assumptions. Regardless of the data analytic methods we decide to use, embedding our project within the FAIR2 framework that we discussed in Module 1 can guide an ethical research design. Remember that FAIR2 frames data analytics with experiential knowledge. It articulates assumptions about causal relationships and discrimination using causal graphs. It identifies sources of bias in the data and reports back to those represented in the data. Ultimately, this leads to a more ethical use of data and analytics for the public interest. So we want to frame or contextualize the data by learning about the data generating process and the metadata. Remember that knowledge is experiential, scientific, and historical. It is important to incorporate all these types of knowledge into the research design. For example, instead of assuming that data is always an accurate and objective reflection of reality, consider under what social interactions was the data generated. Engage the collective subject matter expertise of people whose experiences are represented in the administrative data for social services, for example, to articulate or map the way in which data elements or variables relate to each other using a causal graph. ask them how the data intake process was for data chat participants, for instance, and what factors might influence their answers. Remember our data chat participants and how their disclosure of personal information like race and gender identities was influenced by safety and stigma? This is important information to contextualize the race and gender information in homeless management information system and our integrated data systems in general. So this context will also help when defining the variables we'll use in our model derived from the study data. Remember that each source of data has its own limitations and biases, so we'd encourage you to tap into other sources of data if needed. For example, instead of relying solely on one data source like the homeless management information system to reveal homelessness as seen in shelter use, we would ask you to consider what may be indicators of homelessness within other data sets. This could include address fields in food assistance data like SNAP, where instead of an address we see a flag for homelessness, or school data that indicate other forms of homelessness that may not be captured in the homeless management information system. After we've decided on our measures, we then think about coding the data. This is where label bias from Module 3 may come into play. To increase the transparency of the data, we recommend that you provide data labels that are descriptive and accurate. So even if you are wanting to measure homelessness, we would recommend coding shelter use if that is the specific type of data you have. Remember that shelter use does not encompass all forms of homelessness, and using shelter use data as a proxy for homelessness may lead to underestimating homeless risk for certain vulnerable groups, thus leading to bias in analytics and subsequent social service allocation. When coding data, we also want to increase accurate representation of people's identities in the data and keep different codings of gender and race documented across data systems and over time for each individual. So let's consider someone who has 6 records in various administrative data at different time periods. So say food assistance, homeless services. The first 5 records indicate female in gender as gender, but the last and most recent record indicates non-binary. So instead of coding gender as female because it's the most common flag, or maybe non-binary because it's the most recent data point, we want to code each gender value with the system it was recorded and in the specific time period it was recorded. So we'd say non-binary at time point F in the homelessness system and female at time points A through E in the food assistance system. The bottom line is keep all identities and be clear about where the identities came from, what data sources. Keeping this information allows us to answer questions for diverse identities, always making sure that we adhere to disclosure limitation standards that prevent the re-identification of small populations. After coding our data, we move on to data analysis. We review our modeling assumptions informed by historical and experiential knowledge, articulated or made explicit in a causal graph to guide our analytics. We also identify or screen for bias in the target population, the outcome variables, and the input variables. So instead of only running a regression to estimate shelter use risk that includes demographics and other variables found in administrative data, we might want to consider checking that the causal pathways that link variables, demographic variables and others, with homelessness, and point to the insights of data chat participants in reference to stigma and discrimination. Before we think more holistically about the regression that we're going to use, we also need to consider label bias and collider bias and make sure that we are specifying our regression in a way that responds to the research question that we care about. And these two types of biases were reviewed in modules 3 and 4. So after the data analysis, we need to interpret and report our data and data analytics. In this stage, we want to call attention to any known discrepancies between the target variables and the constructed measures. For example, instead of concluding and reporting health status is negatively related to homelessness, we want to be more specific in our interpretation, and we could say, in an effort to measure the relationship between health and homelessness, we examine a proxy for homelessness, shelter use, which does not fully capture all people who are experiencing homelessness and may underrepresent the experiences of those who have the most significant health problems. In essence, be transparent about limitations of your research and always report findings back to community stakeholders and seek their feedback. After we have moved through all the stages of doing active research, including interpreting and reporting findings, we would now want to apply this to inform real-life interventions and solutions. Be mindful and intentional about how this data is applied to practice. For example, instead of focusing interventions on shelter use alone, because that is what the data we had covered, we may want to seek alternative ways to identify and serve populations that were underrepresented in the data, as we learned from the data chats. Think about Jessie in Module 3. Jessie may not appear in shelter use data, but we may want to remember that she still needs housing assistance, and therefore we should find alternative ways to serve her and others like her. Finally, this leads to evaluation. We always want to check our work because in a world that is constantly changing, we need to change as well so that we can continue to strive to meet the needs of those we serve. If the data analytics serve to inform an intervention, it is important to evaluate how that intervention is implemented and whether it leads to the outcomes that we expected. Remember that social workers are advocates and change makers. If a systemic barrier impacts client care, we can work to overcome it. There are times when we all feel defeated and powerless to change things. However, instead of feeling defeated about existent data categories that are imperfect in the administrative data, we can use our knowledge and tap on the knowledge of people represented in the data to identify and advocate for changes that would improve client care and work to implement those changes. We can promote accessibility and safety as standards in service, in social services, and data intake. Remember that in every stage of the research process, there are opportunities to identify and address bias and therefore improve client care. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned through our 5 teaching modules and how they fit into the research process. As you work through research projects, leverage interdisciplinary teams to address bias at every step of the way. Advocate for positive social change, no matter which stage or how many stages you are involved in. There is always room to advocate for a better world.